Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization 2. Today, we're going to be looking at a lecture entitled Early Industrial Social Dynamics and Reactions. And we're going to be focusing in on the years 1780 to 1840. The question we'll be taking up is, how did the Industrial Revolution shape social structures, family dynamics, and public responses? So grab a pen and paper, a computer or tablet, and we'll begin. Okay, so last time we had talked about this transformation from rural production, home production, and the beginning of the factory system. Our last lecture focused primarily on the industrial, the economic, the technological aspects of this change. In this lecture, we're going to look at some of the social dynamics that begin to emerge as a result of this early phase of industrialization. And so we mentioned that workers began to move into cities. People began to move into cities, partly because the population was growing, agriculture was becoming more efficient, there wasn't as much need for farmers, and so many of these people were moving to cities anyways. At the same time, this new technology and this new system of organizing labor was beginning to emerge, the factory system. And so, whereas previously workers had used their own cottages, their own tools, we see workers now engaging in work and not having those same the same level of control. All right, so rather than using your own house now and your own spinning wheel, rather than using purchasing your own wool from a manufacturer and then getting paid for the wool that you had manufactured by the next person up the ladder, you are now just showing up at a factory. And you show up at the factory that you're employed at. Everything is there for you. The land has been purchased, the facility has been purchased, the machine has been purchased, all the inputs that go into manufacturing this particular textile or whatever it is that you're making, that's all been purchased for you. The owner owns all of that. And all you need to do is you need to show up and to make sure that the machines are working. All right. And so you obviously in this process, you lose a lot of autonomy. Right? You're not working on your own hours. You're not working in your own home. You're not working using your own tools. You become what some historians call, what some economists call proletarianized. Okay? And this term ultimately has its origins in Marxist thought. Karl Marx is the one that popularized this thought. But it's been adopted more largely. It's not just Marxist historians or communists that use this term. So proletarianization basically means that you join some of the lowest rungs of the working class, right? So when you're a peasant laborer, you have much more autonomy. You can set your own hours to some degree. You can you take a break when you want to work. But when you're proletariat, you're expected to show up at a particular time. You're expected to show up and make sure that the machines work, and your pay is much, much less as a result of that. I mean, it's going to be very easy to swap you out. All right. And so you see in these European cities the emergence of this big class, which is often referred to as the proletariat. They're incredibly poor. They own really nothing except their own labor. They can go in, they get paid for what they do, but this is usually a very small wage. Oftentimes, they don't even own the homes that they work in, right? Because the factory oftentimes will purchase homes, give people places to work for a fee, of course, and then so what you end up is a situation where you own really absolutely nothing. And so the cities of Europe start to swell with these people who are going to be desperately poor. And so this is going to result in a massive demographic shift. So there's already population growth happening. There's already this agricultural change and rural displacement happening. There are work opportunities in cities, and so what you end up seeing is a lot of people migrate internally in Britain into the cities, and these cities are going to expand very, very rapidly, shockingly to a lot of people. The population of London in 1800, when they did the census, had reached 1 million people. Contemporaries were shocked that the city was so large. 1 million would be big today, but by early modern standards, it was astronomical. And so it had taken London 2,000 years. London had been founded about 2,000 years earlier. It had taken them 2,000 years to reach 1 million people. By 1850, London was 2.3 million people and growing. And it was the same for other places. The number of cities over 100,000 ballooned in England and later in other places as it began to industrialize. Well, unfortunately, many of the people who were migrating to these cities were already desperately poor. They had oftentimes lost their land, or there was no opportunities for them, or they came from, excessively large families. And so these people are going to be desperately poor. They're going to work in and around factories. And because the population is going to balloon like it does, a lot of the housing that is rapidly thrown up to facilitate these people is going to be poor, shoddy, substandard housing, right? If there's housing at all, a lot of times it's just shanty towns that emerge. And these people are going to be crowded in around factories. They're going to live, you're going to start to get parts of cities that become the bad part of town, the working class part of town, the tenements, the factories. And increasingly, you're going to see wealthier people moving into their own enclaves, into suburban areas. And so you start to see a stratification, a separating out. Whereas earlier cities had tended to be much more heterogeneous, right? You had some rich people living, but they were living not very far away from poor people and sharing the same space. But you see that begin to change. Obviously, the living conditions in these places were pretty substandard. They were overcrowded. Cities had always been dirty. There had always been poor sanitation. But with all of the extra people moving into the cities now, this just became a nightmare. This was a time when indoor plumbing was virtually non-existent, so there's poor sanitation. People would dump their waste out their windows often, or if they did have toilet facilities, they would be used by a lot of people. It would be an outhouse. Water quality was terrible, oftentimes because human feces and human waste and animal waste would just wash into rivers and streams. Even in places that used wells, these underground water channels are connected. And so the water quality was terrible. And so this meant that diseases would expand very rapidly, like diseases that are carried via human waste, like cholera. We start to see cholera epidemics spread. Oftentimes what would happen is that a toilet or a bathroom facility would be located too close to a well, and that it would leach into there. And once these diseases get into the water supply, everybody in the area would get them, as well as diseases that are spread through the respiratory system. Crime in many of these neighborhoods is really prevalent. Not only are people poor, but oftentimes parents are at work, and so children are unsupervised, or people turn to crime because they don't have a other alternative. You also start to see other social ills like alcoholism, hard drinking, hard liquor. You start to see prostitution. You see a prevalence of mental health disorders. You get you get domestic violence, and really all sorts of social ills. And the situation was so obvious that even people who had moved to suburbs, you really couldn't ignore it. I mean, criminality would, could spread. Gangs could spread. When a disease emerged in one part of town, it didn't stay in the poor section of town. It began to migrate out of there. And so you have epidemics that even people who wanted to ignore it really couldn't ignore. And so these are terrible home conditions, but work conditions are obviously going to be really, really bad. Industrialization opened up new jobs, but oftentimes these jobs were pretty difficult. And so one of the things that industrial society needed was mines, obviously, to get the coal that was going to run the factories. And mining has always been a really dangerous job. Hours during these times were usually 12 to 16 hours a day. It's very hazardous work. You're deep underground, chipping away, and so mine collapses were common. When you're digging up and picking at coal all day, it sends up clouds of soot, and so oftentimes this is ingested, and the lungs of workers would soon become destroyed through what is called black lung disease. Okay. There were also underground. There were also noxious gases. And so you've heard the expression, the canary in a coal mine. And this was based on the practice of bringing a canary down. Because their lungs are small, if there were noxious gases, the canary would die first, and then people knew that they had been ingesting poisonous gases. And so they would be able to hopefully escape before suffocating. In addition to this, mining is hard. Even in the the best circumstances, you're just laboring, doing hard labor, moving trucks of coal up to the surface. Oftentimes, for the miners, they will spend their all of the daylight hours underground in darkness, usually in cramped conditions, and so posture is affected. And so, you can imagine if you're doing this for 6 days a week, of 6 days a week at a 16-hour job where you never see the sun, it could be pretty bleak, not only for your physical health, but also for your mental health. Factory work might have been slightly better, but this was no picnic either. Again, the hours are long. You're working by the clock. And remember, a lot of these people are coming from agricultural places where there's, they work hard, but it's seasonal work. There are busy times and not so busy times. You're working at your own pace. It's a more natural environment. You work according to the daylight hours and the seasons, and you're outdoors. But now you're in a factory, and you have to keep up with the machine. The clock is your master. You might have an overseer who can dock you pay or maybe even beat you. You are really at the mercy of how fast the owner wants to work the machine. You know that you're very replaceable because this is unskilled work. You are, it doesn't take long to train someone to replace you, and there's always a bigger pool of workers outside who no matter how bad your job is, they want it, because if they don't get it, then they're going to face ruin. All right? And so so the place you're living at home isn't great, but work is even worse. All right? And industrialization, the mechanization process, also began to change the workforce. Traditionally, peasants had often done not industrial, but like the textile manufacturing in their home. Sometimes maybe in the off season, families would do it. And generally, women would spin, and they would take the raw wool and they would spin it into thread. And men would weave. Weaving was considered, it required a little more physical strength. It was also considered a higher skilled job. And so many weavers could get a decent salary for doing this work, and many of the males took pride in being able to provide for their family. Factory work was different, though, because the machine essentially did all of the work. The machine had been designed so that the machine was skillful. All you really needed to do was to flip levers and take a new bolt of cloth and put it on the machine, and the machine essentially did all of the work for you. And so, you might have to mind many machines, but the actual skill involved was very low. And so factory owners, who were in a very competitive environment themselves, right? So the nature of the market demanded that things be produced at the lowest possible cost. They were always looking for not only a new piece of technology that would make the job faster, or a new source of cotton perhaps that would be cheaper, but they were always trying to get cheaper labor as well. And so this meant that oftentimes factory owners would prefer to hire women because legally they could pay women a lower amount than men. Men oftentimes would refuse to work for a certain amount, but they found that there was a large pool of women who were perhaps more socially vulnerable and therefore willing to work at a cheaper rate than men would. Oftentimes, factory workers also found that women tended to be more docile than men were. A lot of men, particularly men who were coming out of positions where they were weaving and had a lot of pride, that they were harder to break than women. And so oftentimes they would prefer to hire women, especially young women, to work in factories. And young women were even more docile than maybe older women, but more importantly, younger women would be less likely to have families and therefore family responsibilities. And so a lot of younger women began to enter the factory. And for a while, factories were actually dominated by females. Okay. So women would work cheaper than men, but who would work even cheaper were children. All right. Now, it wasn't uncommon prior to the Industrial Revolution for for children to help their parents out around the house. It wasn't like child labor was a creation of the Industrial Revolution. You know, perhaps they could do little tasks that would help their parents, you know, whether it be agricultural or even, you know, around the workshop, perhaps. But industrialization really took child labor and changed it radically. Factory workers found that a lot of people who were moving to the cities were so destitute that they needed the labor of all members of their family, all members who could possibly work, just to bring in extra income to feed, you know, what was usually large families. And so oftentimes children would be employed. And so, you know, generally it would be in later childhood, 10 years old, 12 years old. But it wasn't unheard of to have children as young as 6 years old entering into the factories. And factory labor was obviously really bad for children. And mining work, because they were also employed in mine, was even worse, right? And so it was bad for their health. I didn't mention with the factories, but the miners were dying of black lung disease, and factory workers who were working with cotton fibers tended to die from white lung disease. And this was caused because the manufacturer of cotton textiles would put up a lot of lint and particulate matter into the atmosphere. And so if you actually walked into one of these factories, there'd be little floaties everywhere. And what would happen from working in this environment is that you would ingest these and they would get lodged into your lungs, and so they would cause all sorts of respiratory ailments. And so this was a bad environment for children to be working in. In the factory, in the mines, obviously, they were facing the same danger as adults. Factory work was also dangerous because a lot of times the machines were not designed with safety in mind. They had a lot of sharp gears and mechanisms, and it was fairly common for an article of clothing to get stuck in a machine and then drag the person that was wearing it into the machine. And so a lot of people would lose arms or limbs, or even in some cases get killed because they had been sucked into the machine and ground to death. And so this was pretty dangerous work, and workers who were injured were not compensated for it. And as a matter of fact, they probably lost pay. And if they couldn't work anymore, they were just disposed of and replaced by that big pool of people who wanted the job. So this is dangerous and more tragic when it's a child, right? Obviously, too, if children are working, they're not in school, and so they're not getting educational development, and so they're essentially doomed to a short, miserable, impoverished life like their parents are, right? There's not going to be any opportunity. It's bad for their mental development, working the same long hours that adults were working, and also bad for their physical development. So if you could, if hunching over a machine was bad for an adult, you can imagine how bad it is for children who are growing. Or if having to hunch down all day because you're working in a mine tunnel is bad for children, for adults, how bad is it for someone whose bones are still growing? And so it was common to be able to tell if a child was a member of the working class just by their physical development. A lot of the children who worked in mines were hunched over. They didn't develop properly. Their hands were gnarled, and they were much shorter and much more malnourished than children who would grow up in other environments. And so again, this was bad enough that even in a country which prided itself on laissez-faire, you may remember back to a lecture that I did where I mentioned Adam Smith, laissez-faire, leave it alone, hands off. Even for a country that prided itself on not getting involved in other people's business like Britain did, this was outrageous even by those standards. As people became aware of the conditions in factories, as news got out of how bad conditions were in mine, especially for children, it started a public debate on children's rights and on the justice of the system and on the need for education, to educate children, on the need to make these conditions safer and less horrendous than they were. And on getting children's health, even of the most destitute, into the public consciousness. So, as I said, for middle-class people, bourgeois people, many of whom had mixed feelings about the whole thing. On the one hand, they truly did believe in economic liberalism, the idea that it wasn't the government's job to regulate industry, that this system, for as bad as it was bringing economic prosperity. Britain was rapidly becoming a world leader. Britain was leading the way in economic prosperity, right? It was the richest nation on earth. England was leading the way on progress, and they appreciated all that. Ideologically, they believed that it wasn't their business, and especially not the government's job, to tell people how to live their lives. But on the other hand, the problem was getting so bad that it couldn't be ignored. Many Britons also felt a sense of duty to protect the honor of women. All right, so this is still an age that sees, this is the beginning of what's sometimes called the Victorian era. And so people have these conflicting beliefs. It's not my business, but we need to protect women. And especially as reports came out, when you had women working in mines underground with men, oftentimes men would, it's hot, men would undress. Oftentimes they would sexually assault women. Oftentimes, even young girls. People felt a sense of duty, of course, to children, that children shouldn't be working in dangerous environments and unhealthy environments. And even to some degree toward men, as people became aware of just how bad conditions were. And this started to get into the public consciousness. And then, of course, there was the debate around living conditions, around crime. There was the debate around public health. Everybody was concerned about that when tens of thousands of people were falling sick and dying because of a cholera epidemic. Well, that affected everybody. And so this started to reach the public consciousness. And partly this was thanks to artists and literary figures. So this is the age of Charles Dickens, who I know many of you are familiar with. You might be familiar with The Christmas Carol, or maybe Oliver Twist, or Bleak House, some of these works by Charles Dickens, who talks about just how dangerous and how corrupt the factory system was in his view. Artists like William Blake, who were both poets and also did paintings and also prints that would just show off how horrible things could be in industrial society. And so it really, in newspapers, would cover some of what was going on. And people really started to question the ethics of this entire system. There was a sense of ambivalence. Among middle-class people, they felt both things at once. We've got progress, we've got prosperity. It's not our business, but these other concerns at the same time. But enough people began to feel a sense of outrage that the government began to investigate. And so laissez-faire or no laissez-faire, leave it alone, free market or no free market, people began to realize that perhaps some sort of legislative solution was necessary. And so in the 1830s, there was a series of debates. They brought in witnesses, testimonies from children, and it was worse than people had even imagined. The level of ignorance of a lot of children, talks of sexual abuse by people who were working in these conditions, the people with mangled limbs and ill health. And so the first ever laws regulating work started to come out of these hearings that were held. At first, it was working hours for children. Later on, the limited working hours were for women as well. People felt these were the two most vulnerable classes. In addition, there were efforts to make sure that even poor children could receive an education. So factory owners were required to pay for the education of children that they employed. Efforts to make conditions safer for workers in general. And then also what comes out of this a little bit later is the Board of Health. I think it was 1850, I believe, the Board of Health began in London. And the Board of Health began to regulate where you could dump waste. It began to impose zoning laws so that you couldn't have the places where people lived next to toxic environments. It regulated how crowded conditions could be. All right. And so this is really the beginning of the government taking a responsibility for the welfare of people who lived within its borders. They were obviously pretty modest at first. Child labor wasn't outlawed. It was just regulated. Working conditions were made safer, but not safe. But nonetheless, it marked a turning point and a movement toward workers' rights. The 1830s and 1840s also mark a shift in workers themselves